On the pasuk, the Moshe says, "Ben me'av esim shana noichayim." I'm 120 years old today. Lo ucha lo idlatzis v'lovi. I can no longer go out and come in. Chazal tell us that this does not mean literally that he cannot go out and come in physically because he's weak or something like that. Rather, it means you can no longer go out and come in the words of Torah, b'divrei Torah. Melamed, this teaches us shenistatmu mimenu shari chochma, that the gates of wisdom were closed to him. Now, this statement is also brought in Rashi ala Torah, but in slightly different words. Instead of shari chochma, instead of that the gates of wisdom were blocked to him, Rashi says mesoiros. Mesoiros are the things that are passed down orally. Umayones hachochma, and the well springs of chochma. Now, the truth is that Ein Yaakov, and so too some of the Rishonim, do have a version in the Gemara, the word Ma'ayonis, well springs, instead of Share, instead of gates. In the Tanchuma, in Parshas Vayeschanan, the version there is Mesoiris HaChochma. Rashi is somehow combining these two things, Mesoiris and Ma'ayonis. Says the Rebbe, we need to have an explanation. First of all, why doesn't Rashi bring the common Girsa, the common version of the Gemara, Share Chochma? More importantly, says the Rebbe, we don't find this combination anywhere in the Midrash Chazal that we have both of these expressions together, Mesoiros and Mayonos. Or we don't have Mesoiros and Share the way we have the version of the Gemara Share, but the two things don't come together. And Rashi puts two things together, Mesoiros and Mayonos. Another thing, says the Rebbe, it's not understood is, we discussed a number of times, it's not Rashi's way of just quoting the words of Chazal in the words exactly the way they say it. And therefore, in our case, why does Rashi need to be using these words, Mesoiros, Mayones HaChochma? Why doesn't Rashi just give a more common expression? As Rashi himself starts off this very pirush, when he says, Lotzos v'lovoi, to go out and come in, he says, B'divrei Torah. So Rashi could have continued in a similar way and say, Shenistamu mimena, that was closed from him, Divrei Torah. Why these expressions of Mesoiros and Mayones HaChochma? Says the Rebbe, Rashi is actually coming over here to preempt and to answer a very, very simple and obvious question, which people refer to as a klotz kasha, which the Rebbe says, in the meantime, I have not seen that any of the Mefarshim should actually deal with. How, in fact, could we say that loy uchaloy lotzes v'lovi means b'divrei Torah when Moshe Rabbeinu is immediately about to say many words of Torah? The three parshas of Vayelech, Hazinu, and V'zois HaBrocha. It is only the very last 8 psukim that start off with the words Vayomos Shomoshe, the Moshe Rabbeinu passes away. Here we have two opinions, as Rashi himself also brings, whether Yeshua wrote those or Moshe Rabbeinu wrote those with tears. But regarding parshas Vayelech, parshas Hazinu, and most of V'zois HaBrocha, until those last 8 psukim, there's no question, there's no argument that Moshe Rabbeinu said it and wrote it. So what does it mean that Moshe Rabbeinu could no longer be giving over Divrei Torah, or that the Divrei Torah were blocked from him? We cannot say that Divrei Torah means only in matters of halacha, and therefore we'll say that halacha he cannot be giving over anymore, because in addition to the fact that it's very, very difficult to say that while Moshe Rabbeinu is saying 3 parshas of Torah shebiksav, you're not going to include that in Divrei Torah. In addition to that, says the Rebbe, even in these parshas themselves, we have halachas. We have mitzvahs hakel, we have the mitzvah of writing a sefer Torah, and other things. So again, the question is, what would it mean that Divrei Torah were now closed to Moshe Rabbeinu when he's saying 3 parshas? Furthermore, every single word in Torah shebiksav was given to Moshe Rabbeinu also with its interpretation, with its explanation, the way it's expanded on in Torah Shebaal Peh. Because that's the way we can know clearly what Torah Shebiksav is telling us, as it's quite obvious. And since these 3 parshas, Vayelech, Hazinu, and Brocha, were given by Moshe Rabbeinu to the Yidden, surely he gave over everything that was necessary to understand these parshas. In other words, including also the explanations of Torah Shebaal Peh. So how can we say that Moshe Rabbeinu is saying, I can no longer go out and come in the words of Torah, when he's giving them these 3 parshas, including with its interpretations of Torah Shebaal Peh? This is why Rashi adds these words, that what was blocked from him was Mesoiros u'Mayones HaChochma, which we're going to explain what these things mean. It's in regards to these 2 things, Mesoiros and Mayones HaChochma, we could say that they are in fact not included in Divrei Torah that Moshe Rabbeinu was teaching the Yidden in these 3 parshas, as we'll explain. So what are Mesoiris? Mesoiris are things that were given over to Moshe Rabbeinu at Har Sinai, given over orally. But more specifically, says the Rebbe, it's referring to those things that are not even alluded to, not hinted to in Torah Shebeksav. The Gemara says, Torah roiv b'ksav umiyut alpeh. What does this mean? Rashi explains, roiv b'ksav means that most of the halachas of Torah are dependent. We could find how it's expounded from different psukim, from the Midas Shah Torah and the Dreshes, but in other words, they have certain bases hinted to in Torah Shebeksav. Mi'uta al-peh, the minority is oral, meaning there's a minority of the halachas that we don't even have a remez, or don't even have a hint of them, they're not even alluded to in the Torah. Rather, it was just given to Moshe Rabbeinu completely orally. So when we say Mesoiros are no longer being given by Moshe Rabbeinu, we're referring to these things that are oral completely without being based, without showing that there's a connection to Torah Shebeksav. Ma'yonis ha'chachma mean? Also, not the actual halachas of Torah Sheba'al Peh, rather the pilpul of Torah, which is similar to a wellspring, as the Mishnah calls it, Mayon HaMizgaber, like a wellspring that just goes more and more and more, getting stronger and stronger. So pilpul doiraisa, the pilpul of Torah, has absolutely no limit. As the pasuk says regarding Torah, Rucha me'eretz midah, it's longer than a measured land, Ruchavi, it's broader than the sea, as we could see clearly. From this we understand, says the Rebbe, and this is also again quite obvious, that in the Divrei Torah that Moshe Rabbeinu is learning with Yidden, and even what we said before, the Pirush, the explanation of Torah Sheba'al Peh, so that would include the actual halachas of the Torah and their explanations of Torah Sheba'al Peh, but not the pilpul of Torah, which has absolutely no limit. Especially, says that according to what the Gemara says, that the pilpul of Torah was actually only given to Moshe Rabbeinu and to his children. It's only Moshe Rabbeinu was generous with this, and he shared this with the Yidden as well. If that's the case, we can understand that even if you don't have the pilpul of Torah, the words of Torah that Yidden are receiving from Moshe are still absolutely complete. And therefore, says that it's not a contradiction to say that even though on the one hand, these Mesoiros were now blocked, were now closed off, and the Mayones HaChachma, the wellsprings of Chachma, are now closed, nevertheless, Moshe Rabbeinu is still giving over these three parshiyos completely with everything that's needed in it, both the parshiyos themselves in Torah Shebeksav as well as its interpretation in Torah Sheba'al Peh, which is called Pirusha, because the Mesoiros, those things that are passed down orally, which are not connected to the parshiyos, again, these are not at all to do and connected to these parshiyos anyways. And regarding the Mayanis, the Pulpulim of the Torah, so there's absolutely, again, there's no necessity that Moshe Rabbeinu has to teach these things with the Yidden, as we explained. Says the Rebbe, and this is why Rashi doesn't write in Pshuta Shel Mikra the expression Shari Chachma, the gates of Chachma, because then we wouldn't understand these differences, these nuances, or these particular aspects that we're trying to bring out, that what Moshe Rabbeinu is not sharing with the Yidden now is only specifically what's called the Mesoiros and the Mayonis, which again, Mayonis means the Pulpulim. Says the Rebbe, now we can also explain why Rashi specifically uses the term Mayonis HaChochma, the wellsprings of Chochma. It doesn't say Mayonis HaTorah, the wellsprings of Torah, because he's coming to emphasize that the idea of Mayonis, these Pulpulim, are something that's not necessary for the Torah in the sense of Torah and Hoirah. In other words, as a direct directive, and which then Moshe Rabbeinu would have had to teach it to the Yidden if it's Torah in the sense of Hira, with the halacha that it needs to teach. Rather, these are only additional aspects of Chachma Shabbat Torah, and therefore it wasn't necessary that Moshe Rabbeinu should have to continue teaching the Yidden these things. Says the Rebbe, however, it's still not so simple and smooth. This idea that we're being told over here, that nistamu mimenu mesoiris umayonis hachachma, the mesoiris, the traditions, the things being passed on orally, and the pulpulim of Torah, the wellsprings of chachma, are being closed off, is coming as an explanation why Moshe Rabbeinu is saying why I can no longer lotzeis v'lava, why I can no longer go out and come in b'divrei Torah. In other words, why I can no longer be teaching Bnei Yisrael. It's not speaking about him learning for himself; it's about teaching Bnei Yisrael. So the question is, as far as mesoiris is concerned, as far as the things that need to be passed on, the halachas that are oral halachas, we can understand that if in fact Moshe Rabbeinu could no longer be giving over these mesoiris, so therefore he can no longer be the one to be giving the Torah to the Yidden, because Yidden do need to know these mesoiris as well. However, when it comes to Ma'ayonos HaChochma, when it comes to the pilpul of Torah, since we just said it's not even a necessity, even for the Yidden, how can we say that just because Moshe Rabbeinu is being blocked from him to Ma'ayonos HaChochma, that's why he can no longer be teaching Yidden Torah, Lotzes V'Lavoi, that's why I can no longer go out and come in teaching the Yidden Torah. And we cannot say that the reason I cannot go out and come back in is because I don't have the Messiahs anymore, and it's not relevant to this idea of the Ma'ayonos, because if that's the case, number one, why would Hashem then block from Moshe the Ma'ayonos HaChochma? And another point, why is it relevant in Rashi here? Why is Rashi even bringing that the Ma'ayonos HaChochma are also being blocked from Moshe? Says the Rebbe, the explanation is, from the actual fact that there's a certain aspect of the Torah that's being blocked from Moshe Rabbeinu, which in our case are these pulpulim, even if it's possible that you could say it's practically not really going to make much of a change in his hashpah and his giving over to the Yidden, this itself is a sign that now the time of Moshe Rabbeinu's Nasi, the time of Moshe Rabbeinu's going out and coming into the Bnei Yisrael has now ended, and the time has now come for Yeshua to become the leader of the Yidden. To explain it a little bit deeper, it's not what Chazal say, and Rashi actually brings it in his Pirush al Torah. It says, Pnei Moshe Kechama, Moshe Rabbeinu was like the sun, and the face of Yeshua was like the moon. One of the differences between the light of the sun and the light of the moon is that the light of the moon is always having changes. There's the waxing and the waning, whereas the light of the sun, there's absolutely no change. This is one of the reasons why Moshe Rabbeinu is compared to the sun specifically, because the midah of Moshe Rabbeinu's idea is midah sohem, is that attribute of truth, which is about no change. And in this way, the light of Moshe Rabbeinu is not possible to change in any single way. And therefore, when Moshe Rabbeinu feels that the well springs of Chachma are now blocked from him, in other words, there's some sort of stoppage, some sort of change in his oil and his light, that itself is a proof to him that something changed in the very essence of his light, which is to be able to go out and come in to the Yidden, from Moshe Rabbeinu to the Yidden. And therefore, it really makes no difference in which thing within him changed. The nistimu mimenu, what was blocked. Even if it's in something that's seemingly not directly impacting his hashpah to Bnei Yisrael. But the actual fact is that a change in him, that already is some sort of proof that it's now a time already of change. Not the consistent way, the way things were by Moshe Rabbeinu. Now it's the time of Yeshua, which is more similar to the moon, a light that actually does entertain change. Says the Rebbe, from this idea, how it was by Moshe, we have a hoirah for the avoid of every single Yid. Because even though it's true that on the one hand, who could dare to try to get even close, even one little tiny percent from the level of Moshe Rabbeinu, the Raya Mehemna, nevertheless, since we know that every single neshama has a bit of Moshe Rabbeinu alav hashalom inside of him, therefore everyone could have some element of this avodah of Moshe Rabbeinu. And the Rebbe explains, this is what Chazal say, if someone forgets something, one little tiny thing of his learning, the pasuk counts, the Torah counts it as if he's liable with his life. And the question is seemingly, why such a harsh punishment just for forgetting one little thing of the learning? It's possible he still remembers everything else besides one thing. So the Rebbe says one of the explanations for this is, by a Yid, the words of Torah have to be so ingrained inside of him that it becomes his very essence of who he is, the very essence of his being, to the extent that every single word in Torah touches his very, very essence. And therefore, the actual fact that he's forgetting something from his learning, no matter what quantity it is, has to break him in his very, very, the essence of his very existence, ki'ilu mischayiv b'nafshi, as if he's liable with his life. So too says the Rebbe in regards to time. Every single moment of one's life has to be connected with Torah. And therefore, when a Yid is chas v'shalom mevatel Torah, even one moment, when he could have been learning Torah and he's not, so then as it says, he kares tikares. It's affecting his very, very existence. Because it's not a matter just of the quantity of time that he had lost, but the actual fact that a moment passed that he's not being connected to Torah. And similarly, says the Rebbe, in all matters of Yiddishkeit, by a Yid, the idea of Avodas Hashem has to be so engraved in his very being, so that the tiniest thing in Avodas Hashem, even what we call a diktukal, a small little thing of Divrei Soifrim, or even a Minig Yisrael, has to be noigeya benefesh, has to touch his very soul. To the extent that if he's chas v'sholem even missing out one little thing, even the lightest thing, it causes a breakage in his whole essence and his whole existence. And this itself brings him to add in his avodas Hashem in a way that he feels how every single good thing that he does do is adding to his etzem achayis, to the very essence of his life. Connection with Machaya Chaim, with the source of all life, Mokar Chaim, and as the pasuk says, "Va'atem adveikim b'Hashem elekechem," when we are connected to Hashem, then Chayim kulchem hayom, you're all alive today.